What's up, YouTube? This is Politically Incorrect. So, in this video, I just want to give a brief overview of the two-party system in our country. All right? Just going to be brief, relatively brief. It's going to be basic. I don't want to have this video drag too much because I also want to go into some other things at the end of this video. But anyway, after the Declaration of Independence, after the Revolutionary War, after the ratification of the United States Constitution, after all these bills were signed and ratified, and after the admittance of the 13 colonies into the new United States of America, the one thing that had to be wrapped up was, hey, this country needs a leader. Now, at the time, we didn't have two parties. This country needed a new leader. The one man for the job, everyone thought, the white men who were in control of everything at the time, was George Washington. George Washington was the richest man in the country. He was a war hero, and he was admired by all on the political spectrum. Now, the biggest thing was who was going to be vice president. That was more of a question. And also, what would the power of the office be? The powers. Would he be a king, like like King George was of Great Britain, or would he be more of a figurehead? So ultimately, the presidency is a powerful office, but with limitations. He's not a king. Now, George Washington is the only president and he was elected unanimously by Electoral College, but Electoral College was a little bit different back then. And I'll get into that in a moment. But George Washington was not a member of any political party. He's the only president we ever had who was never a member of a political party. But he did support the Federalists. The Federalists were the majority party in our country for the first dozen years of its existence. By 1792, as things began to stabilize in this young country, and as the tendency is to do when things stabilize, when you don't have an enemy foreign to complain about or argue with, you find an enemy domestically to complain about and argue about. That's the political dissent that was going on in this country. And some other things are going on as well in this country. George Washington, who wanted to retire after 1792, was talked into running for a second term. So he ran for a second term, was unanimously elected president by the Electoral College once again. Now, the difference in Electoral College back then was this. A couple of differences. There were no political parties holding conventions and nominating a ticket. It didn't work like that back then. What happened was you had electors, but in many states, the electors were chosen by the legislature. In some states, there was a popular vote held. And whoever won that popular vote, of course, won the electoral college votes. But then sometimes you still had faithless electors. In fact, I would say you had more faithless electors back then than you do now. A faithless elector is someone who chooses not to vote for the candidate that won their respective state. But anyway, the way things were set up back then was all the electors had multiple votes. Whoever got the most votes was president. Whoever got the second most votes was vice president. Both times was Washington with the unanimous. All electors voted for Washington at least once. Not all electors voted for the second guy once, but both times John Adams was second in place in voting, so he became the vice president. But this flaw would be exposed in 1796 and more importantly in 1800. Now, by 1796, George Washington said, "Hey man, I'm 64 years old. By the standards of the day, I'm old as fuck. I'm like 90 by the standards of 1796. I'm tired." And also, I think he was aware of the fact that he didn't want to be seen as a king. He didn't want to be seen as a king, so he stepped down. And he unintentionally set the president, President, not president, but the president of a president serving only 2 terms, which would last until 1940. So this is the first contested election between John Adams, who was the vice president, who was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who had been in Washington's cabinet, but was a Democratic Republican, a new party that he created. In some ways, you could say the Democratic Republicans were a forerunner of the Democratic Party. In some ways, but it's different when I go into detail here. Thomas Jefferson's party was very wary of the centralized power of the federal government, and it had to do with regional bickering. Okay, a lot of people who were in control of the money in the country were bankers. A lot of the wealth of this country was concentrated in the North, not the South at that particular time. Now, slavery was legal. People look like me were on plantations, but it had not quite spread. You know what I'm saying? Still were not a lot of states. The only southern states I think at the time were Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, uh, I think in the Carolinas. I don't think Georgia had become a state. So all these other states, it hadn't spread it yet to the point where it was a rival to the power of the central government. So most of the power of this country was concentrated in the North. Jefferson was acutely aware of that. So that's why he had the position that states should have more power, more say so. So you had the hotly contested election of 1796. Ultimately, John Adams had 71 electoral votes. Thomas Jefferson finished second with 68. But here's the flaw: they were both of different parties. So you had a president that was a Federalist and a vice president that was a Democratic Republican. Now, Thomas Jefferson and John Madden had been friends, but the friction, the political friction between the two, caused them to become damn near enemies during John Adams' individual term, 1797 to 1801. In 1800, John Adams ran for re-election. He didn't finish in the top two of voting, but what happened was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr finished top two in voting. They were tied at 73. No one had ever envisioned that this damn thing could end a tie. Now, they kept revoting and voting over, and it kept being a tie. So ultimately, what broke the tie is that Thomas Jefferson's party, Democratic Republicans, got a majority in the House of Representatives, and that ultimately broke the tie for Thomas Jefferson to become president. But then this necessitated an amendment to the Constitution, which changed the way that political parties were selected, and not political parties, excuse me, presidential candidates were selected. Uh, each party chose a president and a vice president, and it was electoral votes were assigned to each state, but you only voted once. So that changed. I think it was the 12th Amendment that changed how we did that. But more importantly, the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800 was a realigning election, and the Democrat Republicans became the most dominant party of the next quarter century. In fact, there will never be another Federalist president after John Adams. And for the most part, they got their asses kicked in every election. Whether you're talking about Charles Pinckney in 1804 and 1808. Now, DeWitt Clinton, no relation to Bill, DeWitt Clinton did better uh, than most Federalists. That was because of the fact that the War of 1812, at the time the war wasn't very popular. I think the economy might have been a little bit stagnant at that time. DeWitt Clinton had actually been the nephew of the Vice President of the United States earlier at that time, George Clinton. Not the funk George Clinton, but another George Clinton. But anyway, after that election, the Federalist Party became just, it pretty much became extinct. In 1816, the Federalists nominated their last presidential nominee candidate, Rufus King, who got his ass blasted by James Monroe in an election. James Monroe won the Electoral College 183 to 34. The popular vote was 68% to 31%. I mean, just a complete ass kicking. Um, Matter of fact, James Monroe was so popular, and the Federalist Party became such a distinct party that James Monroe ran for re-election in 1820 unopposed and won every electoral college vote except for one, and won over 80% of the popular vote that was cast. By 1824, there were four different candidates running for the presidency, but they all were of the same party, the Democratic Republican Party. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Now, this was a very disputed election. 1824, I believe, was the first election where the vote was expanded from just rich white people, rich white men, I should say, to white men. So you saw a huge increase in the popular vote. Some 300 and I think some 300 thousand votes were cast in this election. And what was interesting about this election is that it was largely regional. John Quincy Adams was strong in the east, the north. Crawford had strength in the Mid Atlantic area. Henry Clay had strength in the west. Adams had, Jackson had strength everywhere, but in particular, the South. But unfortunately, no candidate got a majority electoral college. Now, Adams won more electoral votes and more popular votes than anybody else, but he did not get a majority. And ultimately, the election was chosen in favor of John Quincy Adams, who finished well behind Andrew Jackson. And it's interesting because the way things were set up then, the top three candidates were in the running for the presidency. Henry Clay was fourth, but Henry Clay, I believe, was the Speaker of the House, so he wielded a lot of influence as to who could win, right? So it's interesting because Henry Clay hated Andrew Jackson, had no respect for him, liked John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams becomes elected president. At that time, the Secretary of State was seen as a position that was a stepping board to the presidency. Interesting that after John Quincy Adams was elected president, Henry Clay becomes the Secretary of State. So Andrew Jackson and his supporters cried foul. They said, "Oh, fuck this shit. Okay, we see what the fuck y'all doing here. We see what the game is. This was a corrupt bargain. Okay, you as the Speaker of the House, you use your influence to give him the fucking presidency, even though he finished behind me in the popular electoral vote. And then you get to be fucking Secretary of State because at the time, that's the stepping board to be president. Fuck this shit. So they had a rematch 4 years later. By that time, Andrew Jackson, and don't get me wrong, I fucking hate Andrew Jackson. He's a racist piece of shit. But I'm just recollecting history. So Andrew Jackson runs for president again, and he runs against the incumbent president, John Quincy Adams. But this time, John Quincy Adams was calling himself, and his supporters were calling themselves National Republicans. Andrew Jackson was by now calling his party the Democratic Party. So yes, around 1828, 1832, that's the birth of the modern day Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson, by the way, beat the shizat out of John Quincy Adams in the election. Electoral college was 178 to 83. Popular vote 56% to 44%. A thrashing. By 1832, the National Republicans were now calling themselves the Whig Party, WHIG. And they nominated old Henry Clay, who wanted to be president so bad, he had ran 8 years before in 1824. Andrew Jackson had a lot of political enemies, um, and this election featured a third party, the anti-Masonic Party, or they were against elitism, whatever. And they nominated a guy who had a really weird name, and I think it was William Wirt. But nobody was going to beat Andrew Jackson. All right, he won the Electoral College. He got 219 electoral votes. Clay only got 49. William Wirt got 8. I think all of them were in South Carolina. The popular vote was 54.8%. No, 54.2% for Jackson. Clay only got 37.4%. William Wirt got something like 7 or 8% or something like that. But anyway, from 1832 to 1848, the two-party system was Democrats versus the Whigs. Uh, the Whigs had a little success, but ultimately, uh, the candidate that got elected didn't have a lot of success as far as breathing for a long period of time. Both times they nominated a war hero, William Henry Harrison in 1840 and Zachary Taylor in 1848. Unfortunately, they didn't last very long, especially Harrison, who died just some 32 days after being sworn in. Taylor lasted a little bit longer. He lasted for 16 months before convulsing into a blob of shit and farts after eating some tainted cherries and drinking some spoiled ass milk or whatever the fuck it was he ate, rotten vegetables. I mean, he just fucking whatever. But anyway, as the 1850s began, the biggest issue going on in this country was slavery. Slavery. As the nation continued to expand westward, more and more states were being admitted as slave states and not necessarily free states. There was and and that's pretty much what destroyed the Whig Party because the Whigs broke up over the issue of slavery. There were many Whigs that were in favor of slavery. Some were not in favor of slavery. So the Whigs who were in favor of slavery, for the most part, joined the Democratic Party. The Whigs who were not in favor of slavery, I mean adamantly opposed to slavery, some of them broke off into little minor parties, but most of them formed a new party in 1854 called the Republican Party. Now, in 1856, that's the first time that the Republicans fielded a candidate for the presidency. Now, contrary to popular belief, Abraham Lincoln was not the first Republican candidate for president. He was the second. The first was a guy that looked a little bit like John Wick. If you saw a picture of him, you'll laugh out loud if you saw a picture of him. He looked a little like John Wick, but his name was John C. Fremont. And he ran against a guy who ultimately became one of the worst, if not the worst president of all time, James Buchanan. Why was he the worst? Because he basically let the Union just dissolve into eventual civil war and left Lincoln with a whole bunch of bullshit. Um, Former President Millard Fillmore, who became president when Zachary Taylor died, remember I said Zachary Taylor ate all that bullshit and died when he became president. He ran uh, under as the representative of a party called the Know Nothings. They were basically a nativist party, kind of close to. You could kind of even call that party sort of similar to the Trump platform. They were very, very nationalist. They were anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti all that shit, anti uh, Chinese, uh, anti-black. I guess you could say, they were a pro-slavery party. They wound up getting 21% of the vote, which goes to show you how racist this fucking country was, still is, but extraordinarily racist. Got 21% of the vote. John C. Fremont only got 33%. Buchanan got 46%. In 1860, the country was so fractured by slavery that there were four candidates for president. But the funny thing about it is, even if all three opposition candidates had been united, Lincoln still would have won. Lincoln still would have won the presidency, even if the Democrats got 6% of the vote. That's how fractured this country was. The candidates were Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, Stephen Douglas, who had been his debate opponent in 1858, John C. Breckinridge, who ran, what was the name of that goddamn party? Shit. They were to the right of the National Democratic Party, but I just can't think of the name of the party right now. And the Constitutional Union Party was represented by a guy named John Bell. And Breckinridge got the most electoral votes of anyone outside of Lincoln. I remember he had 72. John Bell had 39. Douglas got only 12 electoral votes. Lincoln, by winning the state of New York, captured the majority of electoral votes, 180, and became president. Now, I'm just going to say this. Since then, our political parties have been mostly Democrats and Republicans. The ideology and philosophy of each party has shifted and changed over the years, but those have been primarily the two main parties. We've had some third party candidates run for president in those times. Most notably in my head, 1892, James B. Weaver ran as a populist. He won 22 electoral votes, won 8.5% of the vote. Another election that comes to mind would be 1912. Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president of the United States from 1901 to 1909, tried to regain the nomination of his party as president. He failed to do so. So he and his supporters bolted the Republican National Convention. Presidents Parties have been holding conventions since 1832. They bolted the convention, formed their own political party called the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party, and he had the greatest showing ever for a third party candidacy. I had someone kind of dispute me on that, saying, "Well, he wasn't a third party candidate." Yes, he was. He was. He was. Okay. See, people have it in their minds that a third party candidate has to be someone that's anonymous. He was not the Republican nominee. It wasn't a normal situation, but he was not the Republican nominee. He was the nominee of a third party. Now, it was largely based upon his personality. The power of that party didn't last long, but he won 27.4% of the vote. He won 8 states. Taft only won 2. Now, the split of the party led to Wilson winning electoral landslide, but you know, another election that comes to mind is Robert fighting Bob La Follette, 1924. He ran under the Progressive Party, and he won some 16.6% of the popular vote. Won the state of, I believe it was Wisconsin. Did very well with farmers. Did very well in the Midwestern area region of the country. Another third party candidate would be, of course, Strom Thurmond, 1948. Strom Thurmond ran as a Dixiecrat. The Dixiecrats were very uncomfortable with the increasing power that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party was wielding. Now, even though he only won 2.4% of the popular vote, a lot of it was because he was a regional candidate, and he did win 4 states, I believe, in the election. George Wallace did a lot better than him nationally. 1968, George Wallace won some 13.5% of the vote, and he won 5 states for 46 electoral votes. And as far as third parties are concerned, the most recent one you can kind of think of is Gary Johnson in 2016. You could argue that Gary Johnson cost Hillary Clinton the election, perhaps. Gary Johnson got what 4% of the vote, I believe it was overall, 3 to 4%. I know he won over 4 million votes. I think he got about 3% of the vote. Who am I forgetting? Uh, John Anderson. John Anderson ran for president as an independent in 1980. Now, this goes to show you the divide in the parties at that time. John Anderson was a Republican, but he was a liberal Republican. All right, he was a congressman, a liberal Republican who uh, had many things at odds with Ronald Reagan, who was a conservative Republican. Interestingly, even though John Anderson was a Republican, most of his voters would have voted either for Jimmy Carter or they would have abstained and not voted. But John Anderson did not win electoral votes, but he did get over 6% of the popular vote. And of course, you had Ross Perot, who won some 19% of the vote in 1992. And he came very close to flipping a couple of states in his column. One of them was Maine. I think the other one might have been either Utah or Idaho. Can't quite remember. But I still remember his phenomenal showing. And you can only imagine how well Perot would have done had he never dropped out in the first place in 1992. But let's talk about some political misnomers or misconceptions. A liberal is not necessarily equivalent to being a progressive. Now, it's true that a progressive is generally a liberal, but a liberal is not necessarily a progressive. To me, the difference is a progressive believes in fundamental changes being made as far as how our government works or how systems work. A liberal believes in maybe keeping the same things intact, but utilizing them in a better manner. A progressive is more aggressive. I guess that's a perfect way of putting it. A progressive is more aggressive in his liberalism. Bernie Sanders is a true progressive. Obama is a fake progressive. Okay? Remember, Obama 12 years ago was against gay marriage. Then suddenly, he and Hillary are so for gay marriage. It's bullshit. You know what I'm saying? Uh, but that's pretty much. I mean, it's one of the things I want to talk about, but I don't want this video drag too long. I think that it's important for us as African Americans to vote, but I think it's more important for us to educate ourselves on the issues, and it's much more important to vote, I think, on the local and state level than the national level. I'm not saying that you shouldn't vote for president. I don't want to say that. It's just that me personally, at this point, I don't see the difference that it makes whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Um, it really doesn't make a difference. Look, because I still think that we're having failed leadership. Now, the policy is that they are pro vaccine, uh, but we're still having failed leadership in the fact that so many Americans still feel like it's okay and this thing doesn't exist. No matter the fact that well over 600,000 Americans have died from this thing. Some figures put it at close to 900,000. So we still have an issue with failed leadership. So it doesn't matter to me whether it's Democrats or Republicans. Both parties are corrupt to me. Both parties, uh, you know what I'm saying, are beholden to corporate interests. A lot of these politicians are more interested in being celebrities than they are leading. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to me who's the president is, but we should become more involved in the local level and also on the midterm elections. It's much more important that we have representation on the local level, which is our congresspersons and our senators. And we also have to start asking for things for our vote. For far too long, over the last 50 to 60 years, we've been too beholden to one political party, and we don't demand something in return for our votes. We vote out of fear, we vote out of habit, we vote out of tradition, but we don't vote out of a common goal or a common interest. And we have to be more intelligent with our vote. But that's all I got to say. Tell me what you guys think.